Hi, everybody. Pastor Brent here with you, and this is Wednesday, August the 18th, which means we are more than halfway through the month of August, which means summer is winding down, fall is on the way, maybe some cooler weather for those of us that would appreciate a little less humidity, those of us that were born in Northern Ontario and generally get 30 degrees days a year rather than the 35 that we get down here. So anyways, here's to fall, one of my favorite times of the year. Bible study's back on, and we're continuing session number 3 into the study of Elijah. We're going to get into that. I have the launching spot from last week, and we'll carry that through. But let me pray. Father, we just thank you for this day. This is the day that the Lord has made, and we will rejoice and be glad, not only in the day, but in the one who makes all of our days. And we are grateful to you. We are thankful for you. And we just pray that you continue to be with everybody. We just ask, God, that you would just be the God of all comfort, the God of all peace, the source of our strength and our joy. May the joy of the Lord truly be our strength. We pray for those that are carrying burdens, that have prayer requests, that are concerned about things and people, that you would just minister to them. God, may we again continue to remind ourselves that we don't need to be anxious about anything, but everything with thanksgiving by prayer and petition, we can come to you with our needs, and there will be a peace that passes all understanding. We thank you for that in Jesus' name today. Amen. Amen. So, I reminded you last week to read ahead. I hope that you've done that in order to save us a little bit of time during our Bible studies. You should be reading at least 1 Kings 17 and 18 just to stay ahead of me. I know I move reasonably slowly, so staying ahead of me with your reading shouldn't be too hard. I spent a lot of time last week speaking about the isolation impact on Elijah. And of course, bringing that forward into our time in these last number of months and the isolation impact that we've been experiencing. And I asked you last week to email me any ideas or practices that you've had that have really helped you deal with isolation, physical isolation, of course, loneliness, the stress of what we've been going through. And the whole idea is to take some of those good ideas and move them forward to the audience that is viewing us. So do that. Take time to do that. That would be really helpful. I shared some of our stories, what we went through, what we were experiencing. And it was interesting because, again, I was... When I'm in the office in the morning, I generally have AM 800 on, and I'm listening to the news and some of the broadcasts that are going on, and the Dan McDonald show and those kinds of things. And again, they had people calling in recently, sharing their stories of isolation, cross-border families that haven't been able to get across the border to visit, to carry on things, people traveling, trying to get to Europe to visit family that they haven't seen in some times, and all the hoops that they have to jump through. And it just was a fresh reminder of the isolation that people have been feeling, regardless of the amount of technology that we may have. There is no substituting person-to-person contact, period. I'm absolutely convinced of that. There is no substitution for that. Everything else, I guess something is better than nothing as it relates to technology, but there's nothing that is as good as the person-to-person stuff. And I think maybe that's one thing that we can all agree on. So the whole idea is to surface this stuff, to talk about it, to come up with plans and strategies to help us overcome. So I spent quite a bit of time on that last week. So let me take you again to the notes that have been emailed to you. Page 2, number 2, loneliness and isolation. I spoke about the fact that Elijah, for the first part of his ministry, had nothing but birds to talk to. He was sent to the Kerith ravine to drink from the brook, and he had no physical contact with any other people at all. When the brook dried up because of the drought, he was moved by God to the village of Zarephath, and there to find a widow and her young son. Again, he is on he is on the run, in a sense, from King Ahab, who is looking to find him and kill him. So God sends him to this village in Zarephath, somewhere between Tyre and Sidon, north of Israel. Not that far north, but north of Israel. And again, to an obscure village, to an obscure house, again, that nobody would find him. We're under the understanding that he's not moving around too much, because it's possible someone may recognize him. So now he's been teamed up with, if I can say it, two strangers. Let's read some of the story. 1 Kings 17, verse 7. Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain on the land, because God said so. Then the word of the Lord came to him, go at once to Zarephath of Sidon and stay there. I have commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food. So somehow or another, God has spoken to this woman up north to supply him with food. So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? And as she was going to get it, he called, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. So the Bible tells us that God commanded the woman to take care of him, but it appears that their first meeting is random, and the prophet Elijah starts asking for things. First, a little water. Now, remember, there's a drought. So asking for a little water is no small thing. Now, you might be saying, well, Pastor Brent, the drought is in Israel. And yes, that's true. But again, this isn't a very big region. So if there's drought in Israel, which is a little south of this area, I think it's reasonable to think that there's also a drought in the land of Tyre and Sidon and Zarephath. So he asked for that, which is kind of a faith test for the woman. As she was going to get it, he then shouts to her, and a piece of bread. Now look at her response in 1 Kings 17, verse 12. As surely as the Lord your God lives. So there's that awareness of God, and maybe God commanding her to take care of him. There's where we see like, oh yes, something must have happened. I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we might eat it and die. So I would suggest to you that she has little food left, not just because she's a widow and doesn't have a lot of money. I would suggest to you that she only has a little food left because there's been a drought for so long and food's hard to come by, and likely the food that you are able to come by, inflation has overtaken the land. That would be my guess. And she probably can't afford to buy anything. Whatever is available is out of her price range. And those of us in the middle class can understand that, right? Some of us run on some pretty thin margins. If gas is $1 a liter, that puts 20 or 30 extra dollars in our wallet a week. If gas is $1.40, that 20 or extra $30 is gone. If the price of bread, milk, meat goes up, you've got a limited income. And if it jumps exponentially because of a crisis and inflation takes over, especially hyperinflation, you and I can understand very quickly that we would have to choose what we would spend some of our money on. And any money that we had for fun would be gone very quickly. And all of a sudden we would be, getting rid of our cable connections and our Wi-Fi connections and our Netflix connections and our Spotify connections in order to save some money, in order to get some bread. So, you can understand that in the 21st century. You can appreciate this from this many years ago. Verse 13, Elijah responds, don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said, but first make a small cake of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me, and then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, the jar of flour will not be used up and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day of the Lord gives rain on the land. So the woman, the widow, and we're never given her name, the widow is afraid that she's going to lose everything and that they're going to die. Elijah speaks to her a word. He tells her not to be afraid, to respond in faith, not in fear. That's a good lesson for all of us. And to trust God to meet her needs. So there are some lessons there that I just want to stop and talk about. So the isolation impact. Number 3 now. Choose fear or faith. The response from the lady in verse 12, as surely as the Lord your God lives, indicates to us that God had in some way spoken to her about the prophet coming to her. Not a lot of details. She probably wasn't able to fill in a lot of the blanks, but nonetheless, she is aware of that. So he asks for water, then he asks for bread, and then it goes to a small cake or something, and to trust. She says she doesn't have the resources, and she doesn't. But Elijah says, don't worry, none of your stuff's ever going to run dry until the rain flows. So it will run dry when the rain flows. So there's a little play on words there. But in difficult, challenging times, and especially when we feel isolated, we're number one, we're trying to be obedient to the Word of God in all ways, but we experience the impact of isolation. That is alleviated somewhat when Elijah goes to this house to stay with the woman and the son. But again, he doesn't know them. He's not in relationship with them, obviously. The woman refers to Elijah as the God he serves, or that the God that, as surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied. She refers to God as his God, not her God. So she's probably not of the same faith. She's probably a Gentile. And we know that for a fact because in my notes I have for you that Jesus confirms that when Jesus is teaching about the woman, about this, about God coming to Israel and God sending a prophet, he reminds the people of Israel that God sent Elijah the prophet in those really difficult days to a Gentile woman and not the people of Israel. So that's confirmed by Jesus. So we know that she was not a person of faith. But, Elijah challenges her to choose, right? Fear or faith. Fear means you take your sticks, you light your last fire, you have your last bread, you and your son eat it, and then you sit in a corner and you die. Or you can sow some into me and trust the word that I have from God, that God's not going to let you down and God's going to supply your needs. Now, again, it's easy to say when everything is going well, I choose faith. But when you look into your cupboard and all you have is a little bit of flour in a jar, verse 12, a handful, she says, of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. Choosing fear or faith is a much difficult thing. So think about this, saints. What's in your house right now that you could consume? Let me share mine. We have an all fridge in our garage that we keep cold drinks in the summer and even a little bit in the winter. And our extra vegetables and our and maybe a little bit of extra eggs and some bread. We have an upright freezer with frozen foods and stuff like that. Then upstairs, we have a full-size fridge and a pantry, both of which are usually full. So, that's all I'm used to. Even when I was a young kid living with my parents, they didn't have tons, but they always had enough, and generally more than enough. And all I've ever known is more than enough. If I look into my pantry or my cupboards or my fridge and I don't see something I like, that's simply it. I don't see something I like, but I see all kinds of stuff I could have if I wanted to. Some of it's good for me and some of it's not good for me, as you can tell. So it's easy to say with, a full stomach and a full house and a full pantry that I choose faith. But when you got a handful of flour and a little bit of oil, it's tough. It's really tough. But she obeys, which takes me back to point number one. Even though she's not a person of faith per se, she is exhibiting some faith here. She's being obedient to the prophet's word, and she does what he asks. Verse 15, she went away and did as Elijah told her. So there was food every day for Elijah, for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord from or spoken by Elijah. So in difficult times, in periods where we feel alone, isolated, or just in regular times, fear faith. Fear faith is the choice that is in front of us there. What are we going to choose? What are we going to choose, right? And we see then flowing from this is Elijah's interaction with people. The woman and her family. It says family. All we ever really hear about, I think, is her son. But anyways, the woman and her family. So let me continue with the notes. Bottom of page 2, dealing with isolation and loneliness. This is a significant event for many of us in the last 18 months. The pandemic has created significant isolation for most of us and has resulted in loneliness for many. Now, loneliness and isolation are two different things. You can be lonely with all kinds of people around because in your heart you're not settled. There's challenges in your heart and in your mind. The people around you may not be connecting with you emotionally the way you need them to or want them to. And again, I'm not going to dig too deep into that. But again, you can be lonely in a crowd. You can not be lonely on your own, as long as that's not too long. And of course, you can be lonely when you're alone. But alone and loneliness aren't necessarily the same thing. But if you have been denied physical contact for an extended period of time, I think it's I think it would be common to everyone that eventually you would miss connection. Now, again, we would prefer to choose who we're connecting with. Elijah would not have chosen a woman in Zarephath with the son. That wouldn't have been his connection. I don't know if this is God's way of giving Elijah at least a little bit of a family for a while, or a family feel. It's not that he's a surrogate husband or a surrogate father. It's not. But the makeup of the household looks more like a normal family, even in those days. So, again, I'm not carrying that too far. He doesn't become her husband. He doesn't become the child's father. He moves on from this household. But, there's at least a family feel there, and maybe that was part of God's plan, to give him a family feel, to give the woman a family feel, to give the child a family feel, even if it's for a short amount of time. But, Elijah begins to interact with people even though the people are strangers, and there's an adjustment there. And we are working through that right now, aren't we? As we're 18 months into the pandemic, we're adjusting to interactions. So there's things going on in your home. you know everybody's condition in your home. You know if they're, being safe with their activities. You're concerned about somebody bringing the virus home. So whether, regardless of who's going to work or who's at home, you're just making sure that you're not doing anything out there that may, put you in contact with the virus and then bring it home. Because for some of you, that's already happened. Not necessarily your fault at all. You went to work or you went to school or you went shopping and you picked up the virus and you brought it home, and the families had to deal with that. Again, so not putting any blame on anybody, but that's made you even more aware of when you go out, whether you go to church or you go to the movies or you go to the grocery store, you are concerned about your interactions. Do you shake a hand? I'm a handshaker. My first reaction with people I haven't seen, men, is to shake a hand. And that happened last Sunday. A couple in the church brought some friends to church. And, I was mingling with the crowd before service. And I went up to them to say hello. And, I put my hand out and I said, hey, if you're comfortable, I'd like to shake your hand. And they were. But afterwards, I thought, I got to quit doing that. Maybe they weren't comfortable and they just did it because I was the pastor. So, we're still trying to figure out how to interact with people now. Not just handshakes and hugs and bumping elbows, but how close to get to one another, family, friends, relatives, people at church, people at work. I mean, we're seeing people again, but we're not. Some of our interaction isn't as deep or as trusted as it used to be. So I did a home visit last week. I went to, one of our church family. I went to their home. There had been a need, so I went to visit with them. And that was probably the first time I've been in a stranger's home in a long time. Now, I was very comfortable with that, but I recognize that there is some risk for me, for people I'm in contact with. And so I'm trying to balance, being safe, but not being fearful. I want to re-engage with people. I need the fellowship. I need the proper kind of fellowship. I know I need to be wise in that, and I know maybe my standards and my guidelines may not be the same as yours. And my conversation right now may be freaking you out a little bit. But I want that. I want to get back in the game, so to speak. There's been 18 months of denial, and denial not in denial of the illness, but just in denying one another contact. And I'm anxious to that. Some of you took holidays this summer and you went places. You went to cottages and lakes and bed and breakfasts and, to relatives, to friends. And, there was a little bit of uncertainty and all of that, but you wanted it. You wanted that. So, this is me speaking now for me. I'm not willing to give up much more ground than I've given up. And I'm not trying to be foolish, and I'm not trying to be super spiritual either. But I'm also trying to make wise decisions based on my understanding of what's going on out there and the science and the medicines and all of that, and what I feel in here and what I think up here. And I may get it right, I may get it wrong. Time will tell. But I'm just very reluctant to give up any more ground. I want to operate in faith. I think God is saying to me, now to me, not to you, God is saying to me that being a pastor and a preacher of the gospel and somebody who wants to impact the community, that you can't isolate forever. And yeah, technology can help us to do this or that. and we'll do this or that. But we've got to be out there. There's risk. And the risk today is, lower than it was a year ago. And the risk a year ago was much higher than it was the year before that. But you can't hide if you want to make a difference, if you want to be impactful. If you continue to hide yourself away, you're going to starve yourself and these kinds of things. So you need to make those decisions for yourself based on your understandings and your walk with God and what you feel, God is speaking to your heart in here. There's no verse in the Bible that says, you should shake hands, you should give a hug, you should go and visit that family in their house. There's no verses of that. You've got to sort all that stuff out for yourself. But I'm doing my best to operate in faith, not in fear. I'm doing my best to interact with not just family, but community. I love my family, but my community, I have a community of faith. I have a community of friends, and it's bigger than my household. And I love my family, but I need more than just what my household can offer. I don't know if you feel that way, but that's the way I feel. So bottom of page 2, this is a significant event, meaning the pandemic for us, the last 18 months. The pandemic has created isolation for most of us and has resulted in loneliness for many. And I have in parentheses, your experience may be different from others, but many were very isolated, especially those who were older. Now, again, I understand that not everybody feels the way I just talked and not everybody experienced isolation and loneliness. I get that. But I'm not just thinking of us as adults. I'm thinking of like the whole family. How has it affected you? How has it affected people in nursing homes, people who have family in nursing homes? How did it affect school teachers? How did it affect nurses and doctors, frontline workers? How did it affect the kids that were going to school, and uncertain as to their health, or learning through a screen, or couldn't go to a playground anymore, or couldn't hang out with their buddies 2 doors down? Again, I mentioned last week that I had a discussion with a professional counselor and just looking into some things, some ministry opportunities. And that person shared with me that the effects beyond getting physically sick are very real, very significant, and are going to create long-term challenges for our society, even when we get past the fear of maybe getting sick. So more to come with that. But again, don't be just thinking of yourself. Be thinking about everybody around you and everybody's circumstances around you as best as you can. And you may be the best of all worlds, but others may not be the best of all worlds, and they may have suffered more loss than you have. So just think about that as you're, kind of processing all of these things. Elijah moved from the birds to a woman he didn't know that was in great need. And let's continue to see the need. So let me keep reading in 1 Kings 17. 1 Kings 17, verse 17. Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. And he grew worse and worse. And finally, he stopped breathing, which means he died. She said to Elijah, "What do you have against me, a man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" Now, that's a very strange verse in verse 18. She seems to blame the death of her son on Elijah, and that his presence there somehow symbolized that she was unworthy, that she was a sinner. And so this was somehow or another God's judgment on her. "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" She seems to suggest in our translation that Elijah had something to do with that his presence there, was a cause and effect of that. So I'm not here in this Bible study to sort that part of it out. But again, there are implications. So Elijah comes to this home, and the flour continues to be supplied. The oil continues to be supplied. They're obviously getting enough water to live. Things are humming along. I don't know for how long, but they're humming along. And all of a sudden the child gets sick and the child stops breathing, which suggests that he dies. And so there's this tremendous tragedy. So, point number 5 here is tragedy in the midst of tragedy. I'm going to put adverse conditions. I've mentioned this on Sundays already a number of times. We're in the midst of a pandemic, and they're starting to call it now the 4th wave. But while we have been in a pandemic, life has been going on behind the scenes of the pandemic. People are going to work. People got family things. People got financial things. People got health things. People are experiencing crises that are not related to the pandemic at all. Much of our life continues to go along, and there are adversities in other areas of our lives. And when we would think that just dealing with the pandemic is enough, that, then we got the other things that are going on. Since March 2020, there have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think since March 2020, there have been 5 deaths directly connected to our church family. Adversity in the midst of adversity. We are not immune from even further challenges in the midst of difficult challenges. There's a drought on the land. That's bad enough. And then this widow's son dies, creating a whole nother issue of a lack of trust between Elijah and the woman, the tragedy, or at least what seems like the impending tragedy that is following. And so here's the other thing that weighs on us. Everything is exacerbated. Every little thing that happens that causes stress in the midst of a pandemic is worse than it would normally be. Let me reword that. Death, financial crisis, ill health, problems with kids, problems with marriage, problems with school, those are hard enough during normal times. But when you experience that in the midst of a worldwide health crisis, the impact is felt even more. The stress is even more because you are sorting out all of the pandemic things and then going through your own private thing. And your own private thing may be more private and may have less support because people are more isolated from you. Even though things are better now in August 2021, there is still some isolation. There still things aren't back to normal. So again, you feel like you're going through things alone. In the 5 deaths that I can think of just off the top of my head that the church family has experienced, 2 of them happened right before the pandemic was identified. The pandemic was going on, we just didn't know it. And so funerals happened. But for the other ones that have happened since, again, and I shared the story last week, people have had almost to mourn alone, to grieve alone, to not celebrate the life of their loved one. And even the positive stuff, the birthdays and the Christmases and the Thanksgivings and the Mother's Days and the Father's Days. Again, those are supposed to be happy days, but in the last year, they're just reminding us of what we've lost, not what we have. And, even for the Christians, rejoicing in the Lord always, and again, I say rejoice, Philippians 4:4, becomes a challenge to us because we feel the weight of our losses more so during these days. So it's a bigger impact on us, that there are still tragedies in the midst of tragedies, and that's what's going on here. There's a drought. That's bad enough. Elijah's in isolation. He's in hiding from King Ahab. That's bad enough. He's getting along with this family as best he can. It's mutually beneficial. It puts him in people contact, and because the blessing of the Lord is on the household, food is flowing there. But then the child, looks like the child's going to die. So look what Elijah does, verse 19. Elijah says to the lady, "Give me your son." And he took him in his arms. He took her from her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and he laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, "O Lord, my God, have you brought tragedy also upon this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried to the Lord, O Lord, my God, let this boy's life return to him." And the Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. And Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house, and he gave him to his mother, said, "Look, your son is alive." Then the woman said to Elijah, last but not least, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is truth." Which, that in itself identifies that the woman never had that Elijah never had the woman's trust, right? So he's there with them, but again, they're not of one mind, one heart, one spirit. The woman still doubted him until, even though the flour was supplied every day and the oil was flowing, she still didn't really trust him in his word until the boy is brought back to life. So, again, there's more stuff going on there. But even Elijah describes it as a tragedy, this tragedy in the midst of adverse situations. And so we understand that. We are not immune to that. But here's the thing. The impact of all of those things that wouldn't have bothered you too much in the past, bother you a little more because of what we're going through. Things that would have bothered you a fair amount bother you a lot. And some of the bigger things that are happening can be perhaps overwhelming. And we just have to be aware of that. Now, again, I know it's August 2021, and things, in a sense, even though we're in the 4th wave, that they're getting better, things are more opened up, things are more normal. I understand that. But we're not through this yet, and the impact of this has not been fully understood yet. And sometimes one of the hardest things is to understand what's going on in our own heart. The Bible speaks to this, right? About it's the duty or the responsibility of God to understand the goings on inside of us. That our thoughts are deep, but the Lord draws that out. Even we don't understand that all of the time. And it's good to have somebody to talk to process things, to help us get a better perspective. Now, hopefully we find friends that aren't like Job's friends and that come to Job and say, well, obviously you've messed up, Job, and you're sinning, so confess it and move on. In this case, we're not talking about that. We're just talking about understanding what we're going through and the impact of that on us and on those around us, and trying to help one another just, be well. We just want to be physically, spiritually, emotionally well. That's the goal of this, and that's why we're looking at Elijah. Because, again, James says he was a person just like us. That's fine. Let me word it this way. And he went through stuff just like us. Now, we look at him, praying for this child and raising him from the dead, and we can look in our Bible and say, wow, I don't think there's anything like that's ever happened in the Bible before. 1 Kings 17, this child is raised from the dead. I haven't seen that anywhere before, and you can do the research in that. It's a miraculous, wonderful thing. And it's celebrated by the woman, and she recognizes that God is in Elijah working through him. But it's not the celebration like Lazarus had, right? Where there was complete jubilation. Again, they're in this small home. Elijah's confined. Nobody else really knows about it. It's a God thing, but it's a quiet thing. So all of a sudden there's a celebration in the midst of tragedy, but even the celebration is muted. It's not the way it normally would be. I mean, generally that news would run through the town and it would glorify God and give God a hearing. But all of this is muted, and we've experienced that as well, haven't we? That even our celebrations have been muted. It just doesn't feel the same. Anyways, I'm going to stop there. Keep the conversation going through email. We're going to pick this up next week and carry on the conversation. Love to hear from you. Hope this is helping you. God bless you. Bye for now.